Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're totally stripping away that Hollywood romance of being stranded on a sun-drenched tropical beach. We're going to look at the brutal, visceral, and frankly terrifying reality of historical shipwreck survival. We're diving into the incredible true story of a man who faced the absolute extremes of human endurance, completely alone, right in the middle of the ocean.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really appreciate this story, we first have to ask a pretty tough question. What are your actual odds of surviving a shipwreck? When you look at the historical and modern maritime data, the harsh truth is that being lost at sea rarely ends on a picturesque island. For the vast majority of people, going overboard or losing a ship means a rapid and terrifying death by drowning, usually within just a few hours.
I mean, the open ocean is unimaginably vast and relentlessly hostile. Survival out there is a statistical anomaly. If you don't drown immediately, you are completely exposed to the elements. Without temperature protection, fresh water, or food, a human body breaks down incredibly fast. Finding a patch of dry land in millions of square miles of open water is literally like winning the darkest lottery on Earth. It's an absolute miracle to wash ashore alive.
Section 1. Marooned on a desert island.
And that brings us to our narrative anchor, a Scottish privateer named Alexander Selkirk. Back in 1704, during the War of the Spanish Succession, Selkirk found himself sailing off the incredibly rugged, isolated coast of South America. And it was right here that he made a fateful, deeply terrifying decision that changed maritime history forever. See, he was the navigator on a privateering ship called the Cinque Ports. In this vessel, it was a floating death trap. The oak planks of its hull were thoroughly infested with worms, literally rotting away from the inside out. Selkirk, knowing the craft was totally unseaworthy, got into a massive, desperate argument with his captain, Thomas Stradling. In the heat of the moment, Selkirk demanded to be left behind on a desolate, uninhabited island called Mas Atira, rather than sink with the ship. Well, the captain, who was absolutely furious with his insubordination, took him exactly at his word. Selkirk was left on the beach with shockingly meager supplies. We're talking a little bedding, a musket, some basic tools, a tiny ration of food, and his Bible. Tragically, Selkirk kind of just assumed another friendly ship would sail by in a few days to pick him up. But man, he couldn't have been more wrong.
Section 2. Surviving the first deadly days.
As the sails of the Cinque Ports disappeared over the horizon, the crushing weight of his isolation really set in. With no rescue in sight, this terrifying ticking clock of basic human needs began to sound in his head. So the crucial point here is understanding the brutal survival rule of threes. The data tells us a human can survive roughly 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and 30 days without food. Selkirk was suddenly on a desperate 72-hour deadline to find fresh hydration on this unfamiliar rocky volcanic island, where he would die a slow, agonizing death right there on the sand.
If you look at modern survival logic, it dictates these 4 immediate steps, and they map perfectly onto Selkirk's actions. First, he huddled in small caves along the shoreline, just to escape the fierce winter storms. Next, he frantically searched for streams winding down from the island's steep ravines to secure drinking water. Then he had to build a fire for warmth, and finally, look for literally anything edible just to keep his body functioning.
But here's the thing, the beach offered absolutely no sanctuary. Selkirk was soon driven inland by hordes of highly aggressive, raucous sea lions that had gathered on the shoreline for mating season. So terrified, suffering from deep melancholy, and chased by 1,000-pound marine mammals, Selkirk was forced away from his coastal lookout. He was pushed deep into the dark, mountainous, and densely forested jungle interior of the island.
Section 3. Mastering the wild.
It was in this dark interior that Selkirk's physical stabilization actually began. Moving from the panic of mere existence, he shifted into this incredible phase of ingenious problem-solving. He began to actively master his unforgiving environment, discovering a rugged but sustaining island diet. Earlier Spanish sailors had actually left feral goats on the island, which Selkirk hunted for meat and milk. He foraged wild turnips, cabbage trees, and pink peppercorns to add spice and essential vitamins. But here's the really wild part. When his gunpowder inevitably ran dry, he had to chase these feral goats on foot across steep cliffs. During one chase, he actually tumbled off a cliff and lay paralyzed for a day, only surviving because he miraculously landed on top of the goat he was chasing. And this brilliantly illustrates his sheer resourcefulness. When his original knife snapped, he didn't give up. He forged a brand new blade out of iron barrel hoops he found washed up on the beach. When his clothes rotted right off his body, he used a rusted nail as a needle to sew together protective garments made entirely of goat skin. He even chopped down pepper trees to build 2 sturdy wooden huts, one for sleeping and one for cooking.
Section 4. The psychological dawdle.
But listen, mastering the physical wild, that was only half the war. The true torment of his marooning was the heavy, agonizing reality of total human isolation. Without a single soul to speak to, the sheer silence of the island began to cause deep psychological decay. As one historical account notes, he grew dejected, languid, scarce able to act. In the beginning, he was paralyzed by a near-suicidal melancholy. So, to anchor his fleeting sanity, he began reading his Bible out loud every single day. He sang psalms at the top of his lungs to the empty jungle just to hear the sound of a human voice, desperately fighting to remember how to speak his own native language. And the nights were a living nightmare. In the pitch black of his hut, hordes of rats would swarm him, gnawing on his clothes and his feet while he tried to sleep. To survive this terror, he ingeniously befriended the island's feral cats, feeding them goat meat so they'd sleep around his bed. They provided a violent defense against the rats, but honestly, just as importantly, they offered him a desperate, wordless companionship.
Section 5. Rescue and Literary Legacy.
All right, let's fast forward through years of this grueling, lonely existence to February of 1709. A privateering ship piloted by none other than William Dampier finally pierced through the ocean mist. A landing party was sent to the beach to investigate a signal fire, and when they arrived, they were met by a wild man wrapped in goat skins. Alexander Selkirk had been on that island for a staggering 4 years and 4 months. He had spent over 1,500 days in absolute punishing solitude before that landing party finally stepped onto the sand. He was so overwhelmed with joy that he was almost entirely incoherent. But even though his speech was broken, his survival skills were absolutely flawless. The rescuing crew was actually dying of scurvy. So Selkirk, moving with the agility of a wild animal, effortlessly chased down 2 to 3 goats a day on foot to feed the sick men, nursing them back to health. The ship's commander, Captain Wood Rogers, was so deeply impressed by the castaways' mastery of the environment that he wryly referred to Selkirk as the governor of the island. Selkirk's incredible survival story returned to England and totally took the public by storm, eventually inspiring Daniel Defoe's famous novel, Robinson Crusoe. But we really have to separate the fiction from the grim reality here. Crusoe was marooned for 28 years, yes, but he had human companionship, a massive shipwreck full of salvaged tools, and a large, bountiful tropical island. Selkirk survived 4 years in absolute isolation, battling freezing storms, rats, and madness, using almost nothing but his bare hands and sheer willpower. So what does this all mean? Well, Selkirk's story isn't some romantic adventure. It is a masterclass in the absolute limits of human endurance, and it forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. If the ocean stripped away your technology, your comforts, and every single person you have ever known, would your mind break in the silence, or would you find a way to master the wild? Keep that in mind next time you look out at the open water. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep learning.